The torches hadn't been lit yet, but the marketplace was already alive with sound. Sandals slapping stone, clay jars clinking, and beneath it all, one constant note, water, falling, splashing, running free. In the heart of an ancient city, a spring rose from beneath the earth into a carved basin, and it never stopped. Not during drought, not during siege, not during the hottest days anyone could remember. Children filled jars there before dawn. Priests blessed it at dusk. It was, to everyone who touched it, simply alive. Now picture that same basin today. Dry, cracked, filled with dust and tourist footprints. If it survives at all, the sound is gone, and almost no one walking past knows that beneath their feet, water may still be moving, quietly, invisibly, forgotten. How does a city lose something it once considered eternal? That question sits at the center of this story, and by the end, you'll understand not just what happened to these springs, but what their disappearance reveals about the cities we live in today. If that kind of hidden history fascinates you, stick around. And if you enjoy documentaries built on real evidence rather than legend, consider subscribing before we go further. To understand why these springs mattered so much, we have to go back to the very beginning of urban life. A living spring, in the language historians and hydrogeologists use, is a natural point where groundwater reaches the surface on its own. No digging, no machinery, just pressure and geology doing the work. Rain and snowmelt seep into porous rock, travel through underground layers for years or even centuries, and eventually emerge wherever the land dips low enough or the rock breaks open. Some of these springs produced a slow, steady trickle. Others gush with enough force to power mills. For early human settlements, a reliable spring wasn't a convenience. It was a difference between a village that survived and one that didn't. Archaeological surveys across the Near East, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia consistently show the same pattern. The earliest permanent settlements cluster tightly around freshwater sources. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in the world, grew beside a spring that still flows today. Athens took root near natural springs on and around the Acropolis. Rome, before its famous aqueducts existed, depended on natural springs and the Tiber itself. The city didn't choose its water source after being founded. The water source is often why the city was founded there at all. Once a settlement grew large enough, a spring stopped being just a water source. It became a stage for public life. In many Greek and Roman cities, springs were incorporated into elaborate stone fountains called nymphea, named for the nymphs believed to inhabit natural water. These weren't purely religious structures. They were functional plumbing, channeling spring water into basins where residents gathered daily. Picture the scene. Women balancing jars on their shoulders, merchants watering pack animals, elders trading news while children played in the runoff. In Pompeii, archaeologists have identified dozens of public fountains fed by both spring sources and aqueduct water, spaced deliberately so that no household had to walk far to reach one. But keeping a spring flowing cleanly into a crowded city required real engineering, and ancient societies were far more sophisticated at this than most people realize. In the Roman world, engineers built stone-lined channels called speakers to protect spring water from contamination as it traveled. Some springs were enclosed in small chambers with controlled outlets, precursors to what we'd now call spring houses, designed specifically to keep animals, debris, and runoff from fouling the source. In the eastern Mediterranean and parts of the Indus Valley civilization, step wells and covered cisterns served a similar protective purpose, allowing communities to draw water while shielding it from evaporation and contamination in hot climates. Religiously and economically, these springs carried enormous weight. In Greek and Roman religion, springs were frequently dedicated to specific deities or nymphs, and offerings, coins, small figurines, inscribed tablets have been recovered by archaeologists at sites like the Sacred Spring at Bath in Britain, where over 12,000 Roman coins were found deposited in the sacred spring dedicated to the goddess Sulis Minerva. That's not myth. That's an excavated, catalogued archaeological record. Economically, cities built around reliable springs could support agriculture, craft industries like dyeing and tanning, and dense populations that drier regions simply couldn't sustain. So if these springs were this vital, this celebrated, this deeply woven into daily and spiritual life, why did so many of them vanish? The honest answer historians give is that there wasn't one single cause. There were several, unfolding over centuries, and they compounded each other. The first was simple population growth. As cities like Rome expanded well beyond what natural springs could supply, engineers turned to aqueducts, some of which tapped the very same springs and rerouted them miles away to reservoirs and distribution tanks, effectively centralizing and controlling flow that once rose freely within city limits. The spring itself often kept flowing, but its water no longer reached the public the way it once had. It was captured, piped, and metered out through a new system entirely. The second cause was contamination. As cities grew denser, waste disposal became a serious problem. Historical and archaeological record from medieval European cities describe springs and wells increasingly fouled by nearby tanneries, cesspits, and cemeteries. Once a source was linked, even wrongly in some cases, to disease outbreaks, city authorities frequently ordered wells and springs sealed. During recurring outbreaks of disease in medieval and early modern Europe, numerous urban wells were closed by civic order, not because officials fully understood germ theory, which wouldn't be established until the 19th century, but because pattern and fear pushed them toward caution. The third cause was simply geological and hydrological change. Groundwater tables shift, construction, deep foundations, and later, industrial drilling altered the very rock layers springs depended on. Some famous springs didn't get destroyed by any single decision. They just quietly stopped flowing as the water beneath the city found new paths. And the fourth cause, arriving later, was infrastructure replacement. As centralized municipal water systems, iron pipes, and treatment plants emerged in the 1800s, the practical need for public springs and communal wells diminished. Many were paved over, built upon, or simply left to decay, no longer central to how a city functioned. The consequences of this shift went beyond plumbing. Historians studying urban life note that public springs and fountains had functioned as genuine gathering spaces, informal but essential sites of daily social contact, especially for women in many traditional societies whose water-fetching duties doubled as community life. As centralized systems delivered water directly into private homes, that shared public ritual quietly disappeared from many cities, even as sanitation objectively improved. What's remarkable is how much physical evidence survives, waiting beneath modern streets. In Rome, archaeologists continue to trace the paths of ancient springs and channels beneath the modern city, some still technically flowing far below pavement. In Athens, the Clepsydra spring near the Acropolis, referenced by ancient writers, has been excavated and studied, revealing centuries of use and modification. In Bath, England, the Roman baths built around that sacred spring remain remarkably intact, and the spring itself still produces hot water today, drawing both researchers and visitors who can stand at the very source that once defined an entire settlement. These aren't isolated curiosities. They are a fragment of a pattern repeated in cities across the ancient world, evidence that beneath nearly every historic city, there's a buried story of the water source that made it possible in the first place. Which raises a question worth sitting with. How many more of these springs are still down there, forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered. For thousands of years, cities weren't built and then supplied with water. They were built because of water, gathered around sources that people believed, in every practical sense, would never run dry. Learning how and why those sources disappeared doesn't just fill in a gap in history. It changes how we see the ground beneath our own cities, as something laid alive with memory and far from empty. If this hidden layer of history surprised you, there's more of it buried in cities all over the world. Like this video if you enjoyed uncovering it. Subscribe for more deeply researched history, and join us next time as we uncover another forgotten piece of the past.